Okay, everybody. Uh, sincere apologies for the little difficulties there we had. I'm Tony Kubay, and I'm with the Justice for Immigrants campaign here at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops in Washington, D.C. I want to welcome everybody to this webinar that we're hosting today. It's what is it? Wow, goodness gracious! It's the last day of May, but there's been a lot going on with respect to family separation, and I think that shows in the number of people who are on the webinar attendee list here. I'm looking at 124 people. So thank you all for spending some time with us today. On the next slide, please. On the speaker list for today, on our agenda, we have Ashley Feasley, who is the Director of Policy at Migration and Refugee Services here at the USCCB. She will be joined on the phone a little bit later by Melissa Hastings, the Immigration Policy Advisor in Migration and Refugee Services. And then after Melissa, Katie Cunin, the Associate Director of Children's Services here at the USCCB and Migration and Refugee Services, will be presenting as well. So these folks have a lot of expertise, have a lot of knowledge with respect to family separation at the border and some of the things and the activities, actions people can take to try and deal with that. You see on your screen the agenda for the webinar. I do want to cover one housekeeping item. At the bottom of your screen is a little chat box. I'm going to type in there. We've had to mute everybody's lines just because of the number of people on here. We're now at above 130. That way it'll cut back on the background noise. But if you have any questions, and I'm sure there will be, please type your questions in the chat box below, and we will try to get to as many as possible. Okay? Thank you, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started. Ashley, are you on the phone? Can you hear me? Ashley, you may need to press *1 to unmute your phone.
Thanks, Tony.
Yeah, there you go, Ashley.
Thank you.
All right.
I'd like everyone to take a minute before we get started. Thank you again for attending this webinar. Just a general housekeeping, we will have the slides for this webinar and this recording available and up on our website probably by tomorrow or by Friday at the latest. We know that there is a lot of interest on this particular webinar, and we urge you to share it. Additionally, if you would like to receive more information from us, the JFI team has a designated listserv that gives email updates and includes some of our backgrounders. I urge you to go onto the website and sign up. You can go to the Justice for Immigrants website where it says About Us and Contact, and you can go in and sign yourself up for our listserv and get some of the information that is that's there. We will be sending you as a follow-up item some backgrounders on family separations that we have in English and Spanish that covers some of the points from this webinar, as well as we have a new backgrounder that Tony will be sending to everybody who signed up for the webinar on a discussion about what's the difference between family separation and the 1,500 or so children who were considered missing. There was some information about that this weekend. So I urge you to sign up and to share not only our materials but also our action alert on this very important issue. Congress in particular needs to hear from you about this and kind of that you want greater accountability and oversight. So with that, we're going to get started. I'm going to go to the first slide. And I want to just start with what I just brought up, this issue of family separation versus the nearly 1,500 lost contact cases of unaccompanied kids. Very much this weekend, many of you may have seen on social media with the hashtag #WhereAreTheChildren some reports that mentioned missing children, approximately 1,475 of them. And then there was a Chris Matthews piece on MSNBC that talked about family separation and kind of, I think, conflated and confused the two topics. So I'm going to quickly kind of explain to you why they're not the same and why we need to keep our eye on the ball and explain and talk about family separation in this very vital moment. So today's webinar is about forced family separation at the border by Customs and Border Protection, which is one of the offices of the Department of Homeland Security, and it's the office that is doing, at the direction of the the Secretary of Homeland Security, the separating. These are children that are being separated now. We know that they started doing it this month. The 1,475 children, the hashtag about where are the children, these are children who are unaccompanied children who were already living within the United States. They likely had come last fall. They had been processed through the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is the office within Health and Human Services that does the shelter and service for unaccompanied children. They had been released to sponsors, either family members, guardians, other approved sponsors. And then 30 days after those individuals had been released to those sponsors, ORR instituted a general safety and well-being call where an ORR staff person called each one of the contacts from the list of the guardians and sponsors who had been there to pick up and been vetted for picking up the unaccompanied children. Now, of the over 7,000 calls that ORR made in that time period, approximately 1,475, the calls were never connected. So ORR was not able to make contact with the sponsor or the parent or whoever was designated the caretaker of the child. Now, why would they not be able to make the contact? We don't know. We don't know. It could be that their contact information was changed. It could also be that they were afraid to speak with the government, given the heightened kind of enforcement that's happened recently. Or it could actually be a situation of harm or exploitation to a child. We don't know, and at this point in time, we're looking for more information. But these 1,475 children, they are not separated in most instances due to family separation. They're unaccompanied children. Today, and in our messaging generally, we want to focus on the administration's separation of families at the border and what it's doing to families. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have a backgrounder that Tony will be sending out to you. Right now it's in English, and we'll be translating it to Spanish, and it'll be up on our website very shortly as well. We will also send it out at the end of the week in our JFI Weekend Review email. But it gives basically a backgrounder with all the FAQs that I just went through. Who are the children? What does it mean that they're missing? Why would someone not respond to ORR? What can we do to prevent this from happening again? So this backgrounder will explain a lot of these things, and we urge you to use it. Share it with the field, and then also remember, let's keep the focus on family separation and why we shouldn't continue doing this. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues.
Thank you, Ashley. We can go
ahead, Melissa.
Thanks. Can we go ahead and go to the next slide, please? Great, thank you. So I want to start with a timeline of some of the recent and key events just to provide a little bit of background on the recent developments in this area of family separation. So if you look at two items here, they focus on when the separation policy was first being floated by the administration. So in early March of last year, it was reported that then Secretary Kelly of the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, was considering a policy of separating parents and children at the U.S. Mexico border. And at the time, Secretary Kelly gave the stated reason, or it was reported that the stated reason was that they were considering this policy as a means of deterrence to try to prevent families from making what they saw as a very dangerous journey. In response to this policy, USCCB and many other organizations spoke out against a policy of separation and really tried to push back. And in late March, we did see the administration really start to walk back on this. So in response to a question from Senator Feinstein, Secretary Kelly said that DHS wouldn't be separating mothers and children at the border unless there was some sort of extraordinary or extenuating circumstances like an illness or concern about the relationship or ability to parent. He also at that time denied that they had ever been considering it as a means of deterrence. But then if you fast forward and we look to the start of 2018, there still wasn't a formal policy decision being made. We saw in January that Secretary Nielsen of DHS during a Senate hearing had said that they were still considering, that they hadn't made a decision, and said that DHS was really only separating family when they couldn't confirm the relationship between a parent or a legal guardian and the child, or when they suspected trafficking. But we really started to see major changes with announcement of the recently reported zero tolerance policy. So on April 6th of 2018, Attorney General Sessions notified all of the U.S. attorneys' offices along the southwest border in a memorandum of this new zero tolerance policy to prosecute those who are entering the U.S. without authorization. And we're going to dig into the policy here in a minute, but I also want to just flag that on May 4th, DHS stated in an announcement on the April border numbers that it would also be, essentially that it was going to be coordinating with DOJ, that it was going to be working with them to refer all individuals that were apprehended crossing the border without authorization to the DOJ for criminal prosecution. And they specifically noted that that would include adult members of family units. I also want to flag quickly, and we'll revisit this issue, but even before this policy had been put into place, we were already seeing separation occurring at really quite alarming levels. And so it was reported in late April from the New York Times that over 700 children had already been separated from their parents since October 2017. And again, that was before this policy went into place. And that included over 100 children under the age of 4. So despite some of those statements that we had been seeing that there was no policy in place, the separations were already occurring at increasing levels. Okay, so if we can turn to the next slide, please. So let's dig in then for a minute on what this zero tolerance policy really does. So the zero tolerance policy primarily relates to crimes of illegal entry, so crossing the border without authorization. And for first-time offenders, we're talking about a federal misdemeanor that would be punishable by up to 6 months in prison or by fines. And the DOJ has said that the new policy is really being implemented in response to a report that there's been a 203% increase in unauthorized border crossings between March of last year and March of this year. And we had learned that they had also piloted this policy last year between July and November in the El Paso sector. And so they were saying that they were also relying on the results of that pilot project and claiming that the number of families attempting to cross without authorization had fallen by 64% as a result of the implementation of this zero-tolerance policy. I would flag for you, and you may have seen the recent Vox articles, which really call into question the statistic that's being used, suggesting that it's inaccurate and that the family unit apprehensions actually increased significantly after this policy was piloted in El Paso. However, nonetheless, the Attorney General has warned that they are moving forward with this policy and that any violation of immigration law will be prosecuted. And they've stated that their goal here is really for 100% of individuals who cross the border without authorization to face charges. I would say, of course, we know that that's not going to be able to be carried out given funding restrictions, so they'll be limited in their ability to achieve this, but that is their goal. And I would also flag for you, I think it's important to note that the policy, as currently stated, does not have any exceptions for families who are coming in and willingly turning themselves over to Border Patrol seeking protection. And I think that's really important to remember, as we know that many of these families may be crossing in between ports of entry, but are turning themselves over seeking protection. So Secretary Nielsen has suggested that those coming into the ports of entry, so those official entry points, will not be automatically referred. But I do also here want to flag for you that they could still be put into immigrant detention, as was the case with many of those individuals coming in through the recent caravan. And also they could still face separation, right? Just because they're not necessarily being referred for prosecution for illegal entry doesn't mean that they won't still be separated from their families for other reasons. Okay, so looking in terms of what this means logistically for families. So DHS will be separating these families at the border if they're referring the adult for prosecution. And those adults who are being referred for prosecution will go into the custody of the U.S. Marshals Service, and that's within the Department of Justice. And they will wait for prosecution there within the DOJ custody. The children, if they're traveling with children under the age of 18, those children would be separated. They'd be deemed unaccompanied. And then at that time, they would be transferred to the care and to the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement within the Department of Health and Human Services. Okay, and we'll get into more details on the implications and the cost of this program and the concerns in a few minutes here. But if we could go to the next slide, please. Great, thank you. So as I mentioned, even prior to the zero tolerance policy's announcement, we knew that separation was occurring already at the border. And in fact, USCCB has seen a significant increase in separation cases just in our programs alone since the fall of 2017. And my colleague Katie is going to speak to some more of these trends and specific cases here in a minute. But I just want to flag for you that, of course, our cases are really just a small sample of the hundreds that we know that colleagues at other organizations have been seeing, and a small sample of those 700 that were reported since October of 2017. And with the announcement of this new policy, of course, we expect the numbers to grow significantly in the coming months. And in fact, I think that this is really shown by the recent testimony we saw in the Senate Judiciary last week, where a CBP representative stated that from May 6th to May 19th, so not even a 2-week period here, they said that given in light of the new policy, they had referred 638 adults traveling with children for prosecution for improper entry. And so we're seeing there they were traveling with a total of 658 children who we expect then, of course, were separated given the referral for prosecution. And that's just, of course, a very small sample of what we expect to see in the coming weeks. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Katie to talk a little bit more about what we've been seeing here at USCCB in our programs.
Hey, Katie and Melissa, before we continue, can I ask a question here? Ashley answered one, but there's another one. I suspect we're going to have some questions backing up, and I just want to clear these as they're being asked. May I ask one?
Sure.
Sure. Okay. So the question is, are the fines, are the prison and the fines for crossing, are these new fines, new punishments?
No, so Tony, these are fines and punishments that have been existing in immigration law for years. It's simply that in the past, they've actually devoted quite a number of resources in the past. Over 50% of DOJ's prosecution resources a few years ago were devoted to some of these immigration-related crimes. But now they're saying that they're kind of pulling away the discretion to prosecute some and not others, and saying we are going to try to prosecute every single individual to the extent that we can for coming in, and we're not going to look at whether or not they're applying for asylum or whether they're traveling with family. We're going to try to prosecute everyone that we can under the existing law.
Great. Thank you. Okay, Katie, go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Melissa. So I'm going to shift gears just a little bit to talk to you all about some of the trends that we have been seeing on our children's services side with regards to direct service providers and the impact that family separation has had within our provider network. And so certainly, as Melissa mentioned, the piece of the residential network that we manage is small. However, this is just a very small snapshot of the larger trend that, of course, we are seeing and you all are seeing across the country. And so I'll start first by sharing a little bit about our shelter program. We do operate one residential program in Texas, and we have been consistently seeing over the past several months case after case of child being admitted following a family separation. And this particular program provides residential care for children under the age of 12. So the kids that we are seeing come into care following separation are incredibly young children. We've seen 9 cases in the past several months, and 7 of those only since calendar year 2018. And again, this is a program that serves only 12 children, so we're looking at the vast majority of the kids coming into our residential programs are experiencing the trauma of family separation. And so if you multiply that across the entire our residential care network, the number certainly will be quite large. So we're seeing this pretty consistently with cases coming into our programs. The separations that are happening are primarily separations from a biological parent, both mothers and fathers. We're seeing that on both sides, and other primary caregivers as well. And one of the other challenges that we have seen across the board is that it really has been challenging, first and foremost, for our programs to even establish or identify the location where the separated parent is detained or has been placed. And so facilitating that communication, first and foremost identifying where the parent is located, and then additionally facilitating communication between the separated child and parent, has been an extremely cumbersome and challenging process, and has added on to some of the difficulties with these very young children in particular who've been separated from their parents. We have also started to see over the past couple of weeks, month or so, an increase in the number of family separation cases reported out of our family reunification network. And this is the service provider network across the U.S. that is working with children and families following release from care, so that those youth who are already released into the communities, and we are hearing more and more reports of youth recently released that they also have experienced pretty traumatic instances of family separation. And again, this is a relatively new trend, so we are continuing to monitor this and track this and engage our network as these reports are coming in. Another concerning thing, I mentioned the younger children that we are seeing and hearing reports of being separated. We've heard also some cases of extremely young children, infants, nursing babies who have been separated from their parents and caregivers. We're also hearing reports of babies and children being transferred or transported to the residential facility in the middle of the night. So 2-year-old, 1-year-old children showing up at care providers at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning for intakes. And so adding on to the trauma of the initial separation, you then have the additional trauma of that transfer and transportation occurring in the middle of the night. And so those are some of the concerning trends that we're seeing. I'm sure you are all seeing and hearing similar concerning stories. One other thing I'll flag on this quickly before we move on to the next slide is that we have also, in the majority of these cases, rather, it is noted that CBP had never asked the parent if they could verify relationship at the time of apprehension. So we're hearing more and more cases of the family separations occurring and the parents actually never even being asked at that time if there was any documentation or evidence that they could provide to verify the relationship. And so we can go ahead on to the next slide. And I'm just going to share with you all a few case examples that we have from our network. So again, very young children. We recently had a 5-year-old girl from El Salvador who was separated from her biological mother. And for this particular case, it took over 30 days to establish initial contact with the mother. And the child was extremely traumatized by the initial separation. The case manager in the facility was working very hard, engaging the local ICE field representative as well to try to facilitate contact with mom, and really encountering obstacle after obstacle. So that's a challenge we're continuing to see as these cases are being reported. And ultimately, we were able to successfully engage the support of ORR as well as the ICE field office to facilitate that communication. But this is a 5-year-old child who was separated for over a month with not even a phone call with her mother. So these situations are very real. And very concerning, particularly given the vulnerable ages of these children. We also have an 8-year-old girl who was separated from her biological father, and this was an example of a case in which there was never a question asked at the time of apprehension pertaining to whether or not there was a relationship and whether that could be verified. So we're seeing more and more of these situations of young children, of no attempt to verify the relationship prior to the separation. And I will now go ahead and just move on because I want to share with you a little bit from the child welfare perspective of the impact of children and families, the impact of the family separation piece on the children themselves. So the impact of family separation, as you would imagine, is incredibly traumatic on the child and the families, particularly on these incredibly young children that we're seeing come into care following this traumatic event. We know from our work here in child welfare and in social work that the impacts of such a separation, whether it's on the domestic foster care side or whether it's on the working with unaccompanied minors, can be extremely devastating, both developmentally and psychologically on the child. And so there can be long-term, certainly long-term health and mental health impacts of the separation piece. And the more traumatic the separation is, the greater these impacts are. And so there have also been a lot of research done on this. I won't go into those details here, but I will share with you that the American Academy of Pediatrics did come out with a statement explicitly condemning the practice of family separation, and that statement draws from some of the concerns related to the long-term impacts on the child, and really gets at the fact that these stressful experiences like family separation can cause really devastating harm and disrupt the child's development, really altering their brain health. And we know that this can attribute to what is known as toxic stress, which can have lifelong consequences. So a situation like this, extremely emotionally, psychologically, and mentally impacting on the child, can have a devastating effect and can really carry on into the child-adult years. And so we have seen, even with the short term that we've been monitoring these cases, we have seen children reporting things such as nightmares, mood changes, depression, really exhibiting some symptoms of PTSD, and certainly distrusting others. So this is a big concern as well. When that child has experienced such a traumatic event, we know from the research that this could also attribute in the child's future life to a more long-term distrust of authority figures, whether that be law enforcement, other potential caregivers, teachers, educators. This is definitely something that could carry on into the child's adult life, and so that's very concerning as well. Behavior changes, of course, and then other regressive behaviors. So we've had, cases of children who have started bedwetting or otherwise regressing to an earlier developmental stage as a result of the trauma they've experienced. And so we will continue to monitor these cases that we're hearing come in recently that have experienced family separation, but certainly concerning that these are some of the symptoms and signs that we're already starting to see exhibited in this population, and that may continue if this practice continues moving forward. Briefly, I'll touch on attachment theory. So I'm sure many of you have already heard of attachment theory. Essentially what it is, and this is very key here, it is the concept that caregivers must be present both emotionally and physically in order for the children to attach to them. And this is a key foundational principle in child welfare that really gets at the fact that the physical presence of the caregiver is essential to the child's healthy well-being and development. And so the family separation piece, of course, directly impacts the attachment of the child to the parent, particularly in the first 2 years of life, and we are seeing these very young kids being separated. The first 2 years of life are extremely critical to child development and attachment with the caregiver. And so this disruption that is occurring is something that will have long-term impact on the child's ability to really function effectively and to build and establish relationships as he or she goes on into the adult years. And so this is something that, is extremely concerning, but something that we need to make sure that we continue to reference and be aware of as we're working on these cases of family separation. That the sooner that we can reestablish contact with the caregiver, the better, despite all of the obstacles, because that bonding and attachment period is vital during the initial years in particular. I will end on just a couple of key points for follow-up. We may have many service providers on the line, and for those of you that are service providers, USCCB has developed some additional guidance as well that can assist you in responding to individual child cases and filing formal complaints in cases of family separation. So we will be able to probably send that around as well afterwards. And I thank you, and we can take any additional questions following the webinar.
Hey, Katie, there is a question from Eva Gonzalez. She asks, where is it here? She asks, are there counseling services for children due to the potential trauma that they might be experiencing or undergoing?
So that's a great question. So for a child that is placed into the residential care of ORR, yes, and that is the silver lining here is that, yes, there are counseling services available to the child. All children in care receive that support. What we have seen, however, and what has been reported to us by the clinicians and therapists working with these kids is that they've really had to shift gears and adjust, even in the past few weeks and months, from their role as therapist and clinician to more of a role of an individual providing security and safety to the child to the extent possible. So yes, there are supportive services in place to the extent possible that are able to address the needs of the child and ensure the child feels safe.
One more question, Katie, and this is with respect to, excuse me, the case examples. Have those kids in the two case examples, have they been reunified with your parents? This question is from Michael Barba with the Texas Catholic Conference.
Oh, great question. So in the first case, and this was the 5-year-old girl separated from a biological mother, so the mother was returned, deported back to El Salvador, and this girl was actually reunified ultimately with another family member in the United States. It was actually her father was also here in the United States, so that child was able to be reunified. However, the mother had been the primary caretaker for the child's entire life. Again, she was only 5. So she was reunified with dad, and for the other child separated from her father was deported back to Honduras, and the child is still in care at this time, seeking alternative potential sponsors. So the child is still in custody and care.
Great. Okay, so is it back to Ashley now? Ashley, are you on?
Tony?
Yeah.
Hi. There's this is a question, I think this is back to Melissa, yes?
Which one is this, the ORR one?
Yeah, first there's Sister Marianne asked, defined ORR and its function. Katie, could you answer that?
Yes, sorry, I had just muted myself. Yes, so ORR, apologies for the acronyms here. ORR is the Office of Refugee Resettlement, and through a cooperative agreement with the Office of Refugee Resettlement Children's Services, of Unaccompanied Children's Services, USCCB operates a residential care network, and this is foster care and shelter for unaccompanied children, as well as family reunification services for unaccompanied children and families. So ORR is the entity that has legal custody of the children when they are turned over to HHS. They operate the residential care network.
Ashley, this is Melissa. I just want to also jump in and make sure that everyone saw. There was a great question here about whether or not parents and children are able to communicate. And I just want to flag that, yes, in theory and in practice, children should be able to communicate with their parents, but I want to be very clear that it can be quite difficult. And in fact, children can go weeks, if not, a month or more without being able to speak to their parents in detention. So it is something that in practice should be happening, but can be difficult to actually obtain and be able to secure that communication, particularly for some of the really younger, tender age kids.
Thanks, Melissa. Thanks, Katie. Oh, go ahead, Ashley.
So I think we're moving on because it looks like we have a lot of questions, and we'd like people to be able to have time to continue asking some questions. We're going to, Katie and Melissa have done a really great job of discussing the devastating impacts on families and on children, some of the policy, due process, general international law and constitutional issues with this, this policy change. I'm going to talk for a minute about the devastating cost to the U.S. taxpayer. I want to explain, and many of you have seen our backgrounders, but not only is this policy going to be costly towards the families and the communities that experience this forcible separation, but it's going to be very costly to the U.S. taxpayer. Before the administration began this policy of separating families at the border, basically the Department of Homeland Security, whether through CBP or ICE, would apprehend and process families. Some were sent to family detention, but a large number of them were released, normally with an ankle monitor, and many instances, sometimes with ad hoc cooperation along, with ICE and Border Patrol and different charities. They were released to approximately 9 to 12 charities that are located around the southwest, the U.S. Mexico border. Some of them you know very well are Catholic charities, such as Catholic Charities Rio Grande Valley, that's Sister Norma Pimentel's Humanitarian Respite Center. Others are larger homes, such as Annunciation House in El Paso, and others are operated by the Methodists and the Episcopals as well. And these are all along the border. These facilities would basically, depending on the local arrangement, oftentimes assist these families with a hot meal, a shower, and a little bit of orientation as to where they were, what their responsibilities were in the immediate future, and where they were going to go. And most of the families that would pass through CBP and ICE and then find themselves in a Catholic Charities Rio Grande Valley or an Annunciation House would have a family or friend member who would pay for their transport to wherever they ultimately were going. So perhaps an extended family member or a direct family member would pay for a Greyhound bus ticket to go from McAllen to Boston. And that was the policy before we began separating families. So no additional cost to the U.S. taxpayer. Now, with the policy to separate families at the border, we think that there's going to be a cost of approximately $585 per night for a family of 3, a parent and 2 children, and those costs will all be borne by the U.S. taxpayer. Now, I'm going to play out how we came to these numbers so you understand. When CBP apprehends the family at the border, now under the new regulations that Melissa explained, CBP will refer the parents, the adults, for criminal prosecution to the U.S. Marshals. The U.S. Marshals will move forward with prosecuting parents for entry, illegal reentry, in some cases possibly smuggling, and the cost to detain adults while that process goes on is $85 a day. The adults will go through their proceedings and do the time served under the custody of the U.S. Marshals. They will then be sent to immigrant detention facilities depending on their claims or whether they're removable at that time. That cost is $125 a day. So already we're seeing costs to detain and separate the parents. Those are the parent costs. We have to go back to that Border Patrol sector where we've separated mom from her kids and answer the question of where do the kids go? Well, as Katie and Melissa mentioned, the children now have been considered unaccompanied, meaning they now go into ORR, or the Office of Refugee Resettlement. We estimate that the cost for each bed per each child is $250 per night. That's an estimate that's given by the U.S. government. We're not certain that it's a higher number for a younger child. That's just an estimate. So, for a family of 3 who now arrives at the U.S. Mexico border and is subject to the separation that is required now by the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security, mom will be taken to U.S. Marshals custody for $85 a night, the cost, and could eventually go to a $125 a night detention facility. And kids, traumatized as they are, will then go into a $250 a night facility through ORR. And again, our original cost point from before this policy was minimal, perhaps the cost of an ankle monitor or an alternative to detention program for the community, as opposed to this $580 a night. Additionally, there's this issue of judicial efficiency, which, we can talk a little bit about, but basically, and Melissa can help me here, just so I get it clear. Basically, before, if mom and her 2 kids would come and she would claim, a defensive asylum application, her 2 children would be considered derivatives. They could be considered derivatives, meaning that they came with her asylum claim. But now, meaning we would have 1 immigration court claim, okay, of a whole family. Now, as we separate families and separate children from parents, mom's going to have 1 claim. She's going to have to deal with, her prosecution for entry or re-entry, and then also deal with her removal claim. And the kids may all have separate claims. So going back to our hypo of mom with 2 kids, where before this policy of family separation we had likely 1 immigration court case, and now we could have 3 at a time when our judicial immigration system is already overrun. So I just want to go back and highlight again the numbers here. We are talking about charging the U.S. taxpayer $585 per night to separate and detain a mom or dad and their 2 immigrant children. And then we're looking at 3 court cases versus 1. I submit to you that the math doesn't add up, people. Anyways, so moving on to the next slide. So we have thrown a bunch of things at you. This is a complicated topic. There's a lot of ins and a lot of outs on this. And we want to talk about what's next. We're just getting started on this. We've got to fight and push back. So what can you do? What can you be in a partnership with us to make us in this policy of separating families? One is to learn more. I think this webinar demonstrates it's a very complicated issue, and it's so important that we keep informed with the right information and discussing kind of what the human consequences are as well as the policy consequences. So we urge you to read our material and check in with our website. Tony will be sending you an updated backgrounder. Next is the ACT piece. We urge you to take action in your community and with your lawmakers. Please sign up for our action alert. If you haven't, please fill it out. If you have, please send to your friends. There was a great question about why is the action alert focused on the Department of Homeland Security, not focused on the Department of Homeland Security, it's focused on Congress. Well, we think at this time, right now, just in this initial phase, given the strong statements by DHS and kind of the fact that Congress does have a small but important oversight role, we're really pushing Congress to push back on this issue at this time. We think it's crucial. We probably will turn to DHS, but that's kind of the reason. But the other piece of that, besides setting up visits and doing the action alert, is to volunteer in your community to help other families. It may not be a family that's been separated at the border, but as some of the information about the 1,475 unaccompanied kids attests, a lot of these communities have people who could use assistance, whether it be helping enroll children into school, rides to immigration proceedings, helping, with ESOL classes. We have a backgrounder on the website called 10 Things You Can Do to Assist Unaccompanied Immigrants and Refugees, and I urge you to look at it. Tony will include it in his follow-up materials. The last piece is about fostering an unaccompanied child. So Katie and Melissa talked quite a bit about some of the consequences, very heartbreaking, that we're starting to see as it relates to children who are going to face separation on a more regular basis. Foster care is so important and vital at this time to consider, to talk about as something that you may take on personally, or to share with others who maybe want to give a commitment, and that's how they feel they can be most helpful. So I think we're at the end of our time, and I think that there's probably some questions. Tony, can you go to the last slide? Okay, questions.
So, Ashley, we have a question here from our good friend Dr. Nancy Powers in Columbus, Ohio. What about children previously placed with sponsors and attending school while their claims are processed? Are they in danger of detention, or is the focus on those border crossers today?
So I think that's a great question, and I think that a lot of people generally in the immigrant community are scared. Those that have been released to vetted sponsors and are attending school and are in compliance with their immigration proceedings, in theory, have nothing to worry about. And I think in most instances in action they have nothing to worry about. They need to continue to comply with their immigration proceedings, and they need to make sure that they don't commit any sort of crimes or behavioral violations, as that also could trigger something while their immigration proceedings are pending.
Okay. Related to that is a question from Ava Ava Gonzalez. Maybe Katie can answer this one. What is the vetting process for guardians and the people taking care of these kids?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So the vetting process includes several factors. First and foremost, there is a family reunification application process that any potential sponsor must go through. And that includes a background check on the sponsor. So there is a background check done, as well as a child abuse and neglect check to verify whether that individual has any record with the child welfare authorities. And so those checks are done. There is the application, again, that is completed by any sponsor, and there's also a verification of relationship. So when any potential sponsor comes forward, ORR is vetting through several means, one being ensuring that there's a valid birth certificate trail. The consular offices are engaged when necessary to verify documentation presented as part of this process. So there is a pretty extensive vetting process in place, and some of the children also will be receiving or referred for a home study prior to release that would add an additional layer of vetting through in-person home visitation with the potential sponsor. So there are many levels of vetting that does occur.
Katie, this is Melissa. I also just want to quickly add on that, because folks may have seen in the news that there's also been an expanded effort now. There was an agreement that was recently signed between the Office of Refugee Resettlement and the Department of Homeland Security that will have the Office of Refugee Resettlement sharing potential sponsors' names and their biographical information, including their immigration status, with the Department of Homeland Security to run through those databases. Now, in theory, that could be beneficial in the sense that the Department of Homeland Security has these databases that can provide a very thorough check into whether or not this is a safe placement and whether or not there are concerns with the sponsors. However, we are very concerned, as are others, that there are no confidentiality provisions in that, and that the Department of Homeland Security could potentially now be using this information to carry out enforcement actions on the sponsors. So that is something that you may be seeing in the news and something that we're continuing to monitor.
So, Katie, this is related to the question you just answered, a little bit ago, and I think I know what the answer is, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is there a federal agency that is generally responsible for minor children that would take some responsibility in addressing the very real and lifelong harms that these children are suffering that we could appeal to? So is there an agency that we could appeal to with respect to these kids and the trauma that they are undergoing?
Right. So correct in that would be the Office of Refugee Resettlement within Health and Human Services. So that is the federal agency that is the child welfare entity with care and custody over the unaccompanied minors.
Ashley, I think this one is right up your wheelhouse. Is there a way that cities can oppose this action? Could we get cities and counties, jails and marshals to refuse to participate in family separation? Ashley, your phone might be muted.
I'm sorry, Tony. Please, can you repeat that?
Sure. This is from Ann McCarthy, Sister Ann. I'm sorry. Is there a way that cities can oppose this action? Could we get cities and counties, jails and marshals, to refuse to participate in family separation?
That's a great question, and I think that there are some advocates who are looking at that today. I mean, I think one of the important things is to have kind of a little bit more engagement with the U.S. Marshals on this. A lot of attention has been given to the Department of Homeland Security, to CBP's role in this, in some limited cases, ICE's kind of role, although they're not really as much as involved as facilitating kind of further down along the line. And I don't think as much attention has been given to the DOJ, U.S. Marshals Service. I know that there are efforts, I think, to look into the budgetary process there and look at what's being given, but on a case-by-case basis, I'm not certain. I think given that they're federal, they would fall under kind of the instruction of, the federal instructions to proceed with this. But I do think that is something that could be considered. I think what will be very sad, but at the same time a very interesting moment, is when we do see more of the families. Melissa mentioned the 540 roughly parents who we know have been admitted by CBP to have been separated from their children. When we start to see this in more communities, we are trying to get information now as to where exactly some of the families are being held. So as we learn, we'll fill you in. But definitely a great question and something I think to stay tuned on.
We have two final questions. Let's see here. Emily Walenga wants to know more about the ankle monitors placed on some immigrants. Are they just for undocumented immigrants or asylum and parolee cases as well? Melissa or Ashley?
So I think that's another great question. Under the previous administration, there was an effort to not always put ankle monitors on parole, particularly medical parole cases. However, we did see under the Obama administration some of the asylum seekers, most notably the mothers in the family detention facilities, many of them were kind of forced to wear the ankle monitor. We're seeing more of an increased use of ISAP, which is the ankle monitor, by this administration roundly. I will note I was down in McAllen at the beginning of May, and every parent-led household, every parent had an ankle monitor on who was there. We've also heard from some of our partners in San Diego, in El Paso, and Las Cruces that's what, when they see families, that's what they're seeing as well. So given that a lot of these families are applying for asylum, I think that we're seeing more kind of uniform use of ankle monitors, but we certainly saw an increased use of them under the end of the last administration. I think an important thing to point out is while an ankle monitor is a more cost-effective and certainly more humane than immigrant detention, it's not a true, what we think of as alternative to detention that has kind of community support. There was an alternative to detention program that did focus on these families that this administration chose to end last year. So we do know that there are alternatives that work for this program, and we have a backgrounder that Tony can send you on the link about the alternatives to detention principles that we stand by.
Great. And then the final question is from Sister Patricia Pora. Wow, up in the Northeast. Hi, Sister Patricia. If there's a concern that children are not with their parents, why don't the authorities carry out DNA tests? She asked this question because there are coyotes that are pairing children or adolescents with random adults crossing into the U.S.
This is Melissa. I would just say, so first of all, I think that the administration has expressed the concern that about whether or not there's trafficking concerns or proving the familial relationship. I think that there are, first of all, less invasive ways that they have been using questioning of both the parents and the children. I would also say, though, that there are instances that we've seen in our own program where parents are coming in with birth certificates and with identification documents for their children, and they're not being asked to present those, or those aren't being looked at fully. So I would say that that is a primary consideration that should be looked at. We do know that they are using DNA in some cases already. I think that some organizations, though, have expressed concern with, what this DNA, where it will be stored and what it will be used for in the future.
Okay, well, we've gone way over the top of the hour. It's 3:07 here on the East Coast. It's in the afternoon now on the West Coast, and I want to thank everyone for participating in this webinar. I counted as many as 165 people on, and to your credit, there's still to the folks on the phone. To your credit, there's still 126 of you on the webinar here. We're going to have some follow-up items. We're going to send you these PowerPoint slides. If you need, if we don't have your email address, please send them to me, and I'm going to type my email address here in the chat box. That way we can get you the PowerPoint slides a lot quicker, as well as any other resources that you might be requesting. This PowerPoint slide, this webinar presentation, is also going to be on the justiceforimmigrants.org website. So with all of that, I want to thank the presenters today, Ashley Feasley, Policy Director at Migration and Refugee Services, Melissa Hastings, the Immigration Policy Advisor here at MRS, and Katie Cunin, the Associate Director of Children's Services. We wish we had more time to spend with you all, but thank you very much for spending more than an hour of your busy day with us. And please know that the good work that you all do helps us in doing our work. So thank you very much for joining us, okay? Take care, everyone. God bless. Bye-bye.